Today we're continuing our series of conversations about the key principles in Steve McConnell's new book, More Effective Agile. For those who don't know him, Steve is CEO of Construx Software and oversees Construx's training and consulting businesses. He's also the author of Code Complete, often cited as the most popular software development book of all time. For Steve's full bio, you can go listen to me babble on about it in the first episode of this series. Welcome back, Steve.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, effusive, Mr. Effusive.
Well, I'll be effusive when we get to the software topics.
There we go. So let's get into a topic that is seemingly a more universal challenge for everyone in Agile leadership, and that's the reality of working with distributed teams.
Right.
We here at Construx have observed sort of the relative productivity of co-located teams and distributed teams. And so what is the summary conclusion that we've arrived at in terms of that?
Well, I think there's just no getting around the fact that if you can have face-to-face communication with the teams, that's going to work best. And I think we've seen for a really long time that if you can have the teams co-located in the same workspace, that really is ideal. I had a conversation with the director of development at Microsoft quite a few years ago who said that he felt like the difference between, I think it was Excel 4 and Excel 5, or maybe it was Excel 5 and Excel 6, was that they had moved buildings and they had changed from the original Microsoft X-Wing building where you could have each branch of the team down a separate hallway, but they'd all converge in a central break room area, to these newer generation buildings at the time that had really long hallways and there was no opportunity for team members to meet in the middle anywhere. He felt like that by itself was responsible for a big part of the productivity difference between one version and the next. So, if that can make, we've had countless leaders tell us that when they moved their team from one floor to two floors, that made a difference in error rates and other soft factors in the teams or in the project. So yeah, if you can affect your team output by changing the number of floors you have in the same building, certainly by the time you spread the team across multiple sites, time zones, national cultures, it just, you introduce a lot of issues that need to be addressed to be able to develop effectively.
Wow, that's really amazing to me. I was going to bring up the time zone thing, but I didn't even think about buildings and floors, and it's just insane.
Sure, I think the technology support has gotten better with being able to do video conferencing, and in most cases now that can be done pretty reliably and with very little friction, and that's changed a lot just in the last few years. But I think there's still no substitute for getting all the nonverbals from someone and being face-to-face and going out to lunch, doing stuff outside of work, getting to know people as human beings. And when it comes time to give the other person the benefit of a doubt in a technical discussion, it's a lot easier to do that if you have shared a meal with them or gone out and had a beer or whatnot. And that's hard to do on video. So
long-distance drinking is something I think I've heard of before.
I know you're working on it.
But, the challenges like time zone and language and national culture and site culture, those are not necessarily skills of individuals. One of the examples you gave in MEA is you talk about a company that brought engineers from Bangalore to a U.S. site, and their productivity was a certain level, and they went back. What happened when they went back?
Right. So that was a story where I think the reason that's an interesting story is when the engineers from Bangalore were at the U.S. site, the productivity of the team was as if everyone was kind of the same. But when the Bangalore engineers went back to Bangalore, then the productivity dropped. And I think that the story says it's not really the engineers, it's the structure of the system in which the engineers are working. And it just says that when you get that kind of geographic dispersion, you really have to account for that. And it's not to say you can't make it work. Lots of companies make it work. It is to say that it takes some effort to make it work really at all, and it takes more effort to make it work well.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great segue into today's topics. We're going to talk about three principles that kind of, I think, tend to lessen the hit, make them work as well as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the first principle we want to talk about is tightening feedback loops.
Right.
The overall idea here is don't take any longer to learn lessons than you need to, right? Keep the loops as close and tight as possible.
Yeah, I think the feedback loops are a little, definitely somewhat about lessons, but I think they're really just about decision making and having some sort of a control line on your decision making. So, the longer it takes to validate a decision, then just the more wait states you have in a software project. So, the general concept that you alluded to is that we want to try to minimize the time it takes from when you need to get feedback to when you actually get feedback. And that shows up in all kinds of ways in software. It shows up in defining requirements, getting feedback from, ideally from end users. If not from end users, getting feedback on, what's it going to take to implement these requirements. And if we have, in a lot of cases, we don't have direct access to the end users. We have a proxy like a product owner. Mm-hmm. And one of the more common challenge modes for geographically distributed teams is the development team at one site, or the development team at one site and the product owner at a different site. And if these are 8, 10, 12 time zones apart, and the team needs a timely answer back from the product owner, then that can insert 8, 10, 12-hour delay in the time it takes the team to get the feedback from product owner. It can be as simple as asking a clarifying question. What did you really mean by this? And that's not really about learning. It's really just about how long does it take to get feedback. Similarly, if the team is going to demonstrate its work and there's a delay in that, and say for purposes of independent testing, which we still have a lot of in Agile projects. Sure. There has been the idea that we could have development in one location and test at another location. The idealistic version of that was, the team will develop during the day and testing will test at night. And then when the team comes in the morning, the test results will be there. And that'll actually shorten the feedback loop. So the thought there is going in the right direction in terms of the desire to shorten the feedback loop. The practicality of it is that a lot of times the team does its development work during the day. Test team comes in and says, we can't get the build to work. Something broke and we can't get it fixed.
Spend all night.
And then they spend all night not testing because they were blocked. And then
exactly.
The team comes back in the next morning expecting some kind of test results, and there isn't anything. So now what would have been a short delay if everybody was co-located becomes potentially a day and a half delay because the teams are not co-located. Again, there are ways to work with this to minimize the chance of that happening. We have seen some companies that have been pretty happy with the organization of dev at one site and test at another site. In the main, we've not seen that works very well. And in the main, I think we've seen it work better to have development and test co-located so that feedback loop can be as short as possible.
Right. And I think the specific examples that I was going to bring up, I think that you kind of hit sequentially there is product owners, right? And the notion of trying to shorten that requirements loop any way you can. Small batch requirements is another way to think about that, right?
Right. So that's kind of I kind of think of the feedback loops in software. Well, I think of software overall as a nested set of feedback loops, and it really is feedback loops within feedback loops. And so we've got individual decision making about what are the details of this specific story, but then we've got larger scale feedback loops with iterations, where if we can have iterations that are weekly or bi-weekly, we get feedback on the quality of what we're building every week or two, the discipline of trying to force the software to a releasable level of quality. Every couple of weeks gets a feedback loop in place on how we're doing in terms of controlling defects. And this is a really big contrast with what we had with sequential development, where we could have development cycles that were a quarter long or half a year long. And so we're just waiting forever to get that kind of feedback in sequential development.
So how about another way with the idea of cross-functional teams? How does that play into the feedback loops?
Yeah, the ideal with cross-functional teams is that we have the vast majority of the skills and the authority vested inside the team to be able to make decisions locally, so that if I'm a developer and I want feedback from a test expert on, if I develop this or design this way, is this easier to test or harder to test? And I don't really know as a developer, I can go to that person in my own team, the tester, and have an immediate conversation, get feedback right away. Whereas if I have tests structured as an independent test team, which in many cases would mean that they're in a different building, or potentially at a different site, now I've got a much longer feedback loop. Similarly, if I can get decisions made about what's in or out of the product or an interpretation of a requirement, and I've got my product owner in a Scrum team, the product owner is considered to be outside of the development team, but inside of the Scrum team. So I've got my product owner inside the Scrum team. I can get my question answered right away, and I know who to go to get the question answered, so I should have a pretty tight feedback loop. In other development modes, especially sequential development, if I'm treating requirements as a large batch activity where I do lots of requirements work up front, and then the people primarily responsible for the requirements go off and work on the next thing and are not dedicated to my project anymore, now I've got some kind of question I need to clarify about requirements. It may take me a while to figure out even who to ask,
so
much less get an answer.
State gets inserted there, right?
Right.
So really boils down to communication, or rather trying to minimize miscommunication in this case, right?
An awful lot of errors in software come from miscommunication, and in some cases it just comes from an absence of communication. And as we discussed in our last segment, I think, you get to a point where people need to fill in gaps. They need to make assumptions. And the more of those gaps there are and the more assumptions people need to fill in, the more chances there are for them to be filled in a way that was different from what the business would like them to be filled in. And so if I can very quickly close gaps by talking to a person that I'm seeing on a very regular basis, daily or a few times a week, then I don't have to close that many gaps with assumptions. I can close them by asking.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, a few things that help here that you've already hit on is things like routine face-to-face communication. And if you can't do face-to-face, then you fall back through things like having some kind of virtual video presence, right? We're seeing a lot more of that in our business as well as in the world, right?
Sure. Yeah, the virtual video presence, I think that's helped, and I think that's been, I think it's improved really a lot in the last few years. And I think there are multiple dimensions to that. One is the technology support's gotten better, the tool support's gotten better. Two is I think bandwidth has been increasing everywhere, and that helps with the video part of it. Three is I think people are just getting better at the skill of communicating via some kind of video chat, so that's good. Having said all that, one of the challenges that still remains is for a distributed team is the absence of incidental communication, just running into somebody, at the proverbial water cooler.
Yeah, sure.
And so, like one of the more common remedies we've seen for that challenge of a team that used to be working well on one floor and has gotten split up across two floors, one of the more interesting techniques, but we've heard it several times and it seems to work, is you just close the break room on one of the floors. You make people have a reason to go to the other floor, and that forces incidental communication. And so I think one thing that we haven't really figured out so far is how do you set up incidental communication in a geographically distributed team. And some of that could happen through Slack channel or something like that, where if people get a little bit off topic, that might actually be a good thing. They're starting to get to know each other as human beings, and I think that smooths out.
Well, I remember one of the clients that I worked with here actually had a conference room that had a continuous stream video on both ends.
Yeah.
It happened to be between, I think, somewhere in Dallas and in Ireland. And so you could walk into the conference room, tell the other person to go to the conference room, and the two of you would be like going to a room to talk about something as a way to do that.
Yeah, that kind of thing can work. We have one of our service providers here has the practice when he's traveling of just opening up a video chat with his family. His family has the video chat on at home. He has the video chat on in the hotel room. They're not interacting really, but they're aware of what each other are doing. Some kind of moral equivalent to that inside a software team, I think, can help address some of the challenges that come up with multi-site development.
Right. I know that one of our other service providers here had spent some time at Intel, and one of the experiments they tried was the iPad on a stick kind of idea, where it was actually a
robot
rolling around. And he said it was just ridiculous in thought, but it actually worked. And to me, it seems a little lurky. You have an iPad sneak up behind you, watching you on your screen or something. But that's another, it's innovation. It's coming. Or probably some idea like that is coming more frequently, right?
Yeah, I've definitely heard that story a few times. I think that some of the effectiveness of that depended on the personality of the person operating the robot. And of course, that's true of teamwork in general, as it does depend on the personalities. So, I think at the time those things were quite expensive. And so I don't know how universal those are going to be. But
I think they were.
I think it all just says that in real life, we have many and varied opportunities to communicate, and we're trying to figure out in virtual life what the many and varied opportunities are.
Well said. I think better logistical support across the board. I think that's people are investigating those ideas, trying new things, keep trying, keep tinkering. I think because the communication problem is certainly going to persist. I mean, you mentioned, I think, in one of your summit talks years ago about the half-life of trust. Right.
Yeah, so that was something I learned from a company we worked with, or rather a leader at a company we'd worked with. And his phrase was that the half-life of trust is 6 weeks. And the idea there is that when you're geographically distributed, what you need to know to trust someone, you lose pretty rapidly. And his comment was, when we start seeing error rates go up, we know it's time to get people on airplanes and have some face-to-face time and get that trust level reestablished.
That's great. It's a great observation. So a couple other things that help here. I mean, you mentioned assigning proxies for key roles. That's one that, the people have experimented with.
Yeah, I think the idea of having a mirror at the other site of some kind, having a product owner, let's say that you've got a site or you've got staff in the U.S. and India, and maybe one of the more common patterns that we see, and I think one of the patterns that's commonly problematic, is the pattern where you have development staff offshore in India and the product owner onshore in the U.S. And so this really does not support the idea of shortening that feedback loop, because we do have time zone differences between the product owner and the offshore staff. And the reason that this happens is that as companies are bootstrapping their offshore staff, they don't really have the business expertise offshore. But I think the way to make this work is to really commit to developing the business expertise inside the offshore team, and that can either be done by having a product owner from the U.S. or wherever the headquarters is spend a lot of time at the offshore site. It can also be done by designating someone to become the product owner at the offshore site, having them spend a lot of time at the mothership in the U.S. or wherever that is.
Right.
But really, and I think the end game here is to have the offshore team is really to have each team, no matter where they're located, be as self-contained as possible. And that means fully self-contained, not just in terms of dev and test, but also in terms of the requirements or product owner role, however the team is being fed business requirements. Yeah,
I think the initial experiments that people did with offshoring were exactly right what you're talking about. They started with test, right? So development happened in one major time zone, and then test went over the wall literally to another time zone, and now those organizations are becoming full product development sites. Right, they're treating it more as a full environment as opposed to something that just is an ancillary part of the normal development life cycle.
Yeah, I think we still see all variations, but I would say the variations that companies are typically most satisfied with are the ones that are closest to that self-contained team at each location. We have seen some companies that are pretty satisfied with separate dev and test sites, but those are more the exception than the rule.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, sitting at the mothership and spending the energy, you could do that. You mentioned longer-term staff transferring to another place and staying there with the presence for a while to have people kind of absorb some things about that particular role. Last time on the podcast, we talked about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. How does that become even more important in a distributed setting?
Yeah. Well, I think the autonomy one is a big one in that the autonomy concept applies to individuals, but in Agile, it really applies to the teams. And if the team is in one location, but they're dependent on input or validation from person at a different location, that in itself, even if you could have almost instantaneous turnaround, I think that introduces some social awkwardness or something that kind of gives the team a sense of not really being fully autonomous when they're reporting over video to someone. But then if you insert a time delay in that, which you typically have when you have multiple sites, now the team feels like it's waiting a lot of the time for whoever's on the other end. So this really does undermine their sense of autonomy. And then, so the autonomy thing, I think, is something that we see as being more problematic. The mastery impulse is one, or mastery factor is one that I think is less of something that's problematic, but more of something that's part of the key to the solution, which is just recognizing that the teams want to learn, and they want to learn the business as well as the technology stuff. That's not true for 100% of individuals, but usually there's somebody there who really does want to learn the business. So if we can tap into that existing desire to learn more, then that's all good stuff. So
absolutely,
we connect them up with the stateside product owner or the mothership product owner, and they start learning the business, and that's great.
That is awesome. So there are a lot of other things we can mention here, but I think we need to move on to the next principle for today, and they're interconnected, of course, and that is fix the system, not the individual.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in general, and you just mentioned it, most software professionals want to do good work, but distributed teams can lead to potentially more errors, likely due to the issues that we just talked about. So some old school leaders tend to come down hard on teams that are already stressed out. So what is a strong recommendation in this case about that in terms of contrasting individual versus the system itself?
Yeah. Well, I think there's also an interplay here, with the onshore, offshore, and that half-life of trust idea, which is that let's kind of put together the concepts of half-life of trust, theory X and theory Y management, and then the idea of fixing the system rather than the individual. So theory X management basically says people don't really want to work. They just want to be lazy and get away with stuff, and we really have to crack the whip to get any work out of them. Yeah. Theory Y management says people actually want to do the work, and if we get out of their way and remove impediments, then they will just naturally be productive and get a lot of work done. And I think that if we have a high trust environment, that tends to go with theory Y, where we trust people to get the work done. If we have a low trust environment, that tends to go with theory X, where we assume that people need somebody to crack the whip and monitor their actions closely and so on. And so if we put these ideas together with the whole offshore development, or it's not really offshore, it's multi-site is the issue, not offshore. Multi-site development, the less we see people face-to-face and have incidental contact with them and trust them, the more the tendency is going to be to drift into a theory X style of management. And in general, this is not effective, but if we're trying to do agile development, it's really the kiss of death. And so I think the discipline here for the leader, and that's who the book is aimed at, is the leader, is to not think first, who can I blame, but to think first, what is it about the system that's just not supporting people working effectively? And as soon as we introduce the idea of multi-site, then we've got all kinds of things that we need to look at from a systems point of view that could potentially be preventing people from doing work. So, we really need to ask system-level questions in that context of, have people been given the opportunity to establish good working relationships? Have they had face-to-face time? Do we have adequate support for video, for frequent or just constant video access? So all kinds of issues like that. One of the interesting patterns that I think we've seen in the last couple of years for multi-site development is I think the leaders take on a lot of responsibility for being the ambassadors across sites. So I often hear leaders talking about how much they travel among sites, but a lot of times that's instead of other people on the teams. And so I think one thing the leaders should ask themselves is, first of all, I think a lot of leaders view it as a burden. They don't necessarily want to do it. They're viewing it as good leadership.
Yep.
And in a sense, it really is good leadership. So, hats off for initiative there. But, the people the team really need to trust are the other people on their team. So, if the leader is going back and forth across sites a lot, but individual team members, and in particular, if you've got this pattern of the product owner one place and the development team a different place, the leader should definitely ask themselves, would it make more sense at least once in a while to have product owner going across between sites, or the mirror product owner going across sites, or architect going across sites, so that they have the opportunity to build up the trust with the people that they work with day to day.
Sure. I mean, I think in some cases it's a hard principle for leaders that transition to Agile to embrace. It's a different way of them being in an advisory position than they had in the past.
Yeah, and some of the Agile commentary has not been supportive of this principle either. We have this idea that I believe has been deprecated now of having one wringable neck. This is not.
Yes.
This is not supportive of the idea of fix the system, not the individual. And, I understand the one wringable neck idea is said tongue in cheek, but nevertheless, it sets the wrong tone for what the leader should be trying to do.
Sure.
And, and there are all kinds of ways this come up. We've been mainly focusing on this multi-site topic, but, if we're talking about the team performing to schedule, and the team is, let's say, for example, the team is constantly committing to some number of story points per sprint and is constantly not delivering the number of story points it commits to, the leader should be looking at what is the systems issue that's causing the team to overcommit and underdeliver. Is it an underdelivery issue, or is it really more of an overcommitment issue? And, what's going on there? Is it that the team overcommits because it's actually being starved for requirements and they have to overcommit because if they don't, they won't have enough piecemeal requirements to work on? What's the underlying systems issue? And, I think, occasionally there are individuals who are at fault and we need to take corrective action at the individual level. But I think the point of this really is to not look first at the individuals, is to look first at the system, which is not the team either. It's the system, the organizational context in which all this work is occurring.
Right.
And then we look at the team, and then we look at the individual.
I think of the hierarchy of stress here. That you don't understand sometimes what a leader is under, what kind of pressure they're under from the business standpoint, and sometimes that leader has to perform a filtering role and be more of the kind and gentle parent as opposed to the one that just opens the door and starts screaming. Right. So I think there's some merit of truth to how people in particular positions react to those kinds of stimulus.
Yeah, I think it's motherhood and apple pie in Agile that a leader's job is to remove impediments for the team. Right. Again, this is actually a little bit of a negative view of removing impediments. I think another way to look at it is that the leader's job, I do think that's part of the leader's job, but another part of the leader's job is just to be on the lookout for ways that the team can amplify its effectiveness. And so removing impediments is part of that, but another part of it might be, well, how can we support the team? Impediments is basically a deficit mentality where we're just looking, what's wrong, how can we fix it? It's not really a maximizing our potential mentality. And I know at some point we're going to talk about growth mindset, but really part of what the leader should be doing is trying to model the idea of growth mindset, the fact that we can always be looking at what can we learn from every experience we have and how can we get better.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great segue because we're going to just bring it up a little bit in the last principle we're going to talk about today, which isn't necessarily unique to distributed teams, but certainly can help any team's capacity, and that is the notion of increasing team capacity by building individual capacity, right? I mean, you claim that teams exhibit attributes that are a combination of the team members' individual attributes and of their interactions. So let's unpack that relationship a little bit, right?
Yeah, I like the quote that says it's not the team with the best players that wins, it's the players with the best team. And we could go spend all day talking about sports analogies. and the thing is, I think once we talked about it, we would not reach any resolution. We'd give example after example. And in some cases, we'd talk about how amazing these multiple players were as a team. They're all great, but there wasn't really one standout. In other cases, we'd point to a team that was super successful, and they did have a real standout player. So, I don't know that I literally believe that quote, but I like the mindset it establishes of the fact that each individual on the team is an entity, and the team is its own entity. It is not, it's not necessarily the sum of the individuals. It's some entity that gets created in addition to the individuals, and it needs care and feeding just like the individuals do. But the principle that you mentioned is one that says, yeah, the team, which is really what most of the book is about, that matters. But at some level, the team is influenced by the capabilities of the individuals. And so growing capability of individuals is something that becomes really, really critical over the long run.
Sure.
And, an awful lot of time in software development work, we're just preoccupied with this day-to-day task focus. It's the tyranny of the urgent, essentially, where we're looking at whatever's like right in front of our nose, but we're not really doing the work required to get better over time. And so, if we make that trade-off day to day, a lot of the time to favor today's urgent priority over the long-term interest, that's fine. But if we do that every day and we never do anything else, that's not fine, because we don't give ourselves a chance to get better over time. So in the book, I talk about a couple of things. One is having a defined program of professional development. At Construx, we've spent a lot of time working on a professional development ladder, a really specific prescriptive program for helping people develop their capabilities. We talk about the combination of reading as something that most professionals could do more of, training, which I think is what companies turn to maybe most instinctively, and then really focused, directed work experience as something that if we get into the combination of reading, training, and directed experience, and they're all coordinated, then we get a really powerful ability to improve an individual's skills pretty rapidly.
Right.
And then the other thing I talk about is just essentially common deficit areas for technical people. And I think there are a lot of areas where technical people just don't naturally, their minds or personalities don't naturally turn to these topics. And I'm thinking here of like understanding how to work with different personalities, understanding how to work with different roles in the organization that are not technical roles, but roles where it's super beneficial to understand that most of the people in these other roles have different personality types, and they're not crazy. They just are not the same personality type you are.
Yeah.
And in general, soft skills, conflict resolution, communication, beginning of leadership skills, maybe.
Sure.
And so the interesting thing about technical people I've found is that whereas their attention might not naturally turn to focusing on the subtleties of human interaction, they're pretty good at following directions. And so if you can boil something down into a program where you just say, look, here's what you look at this, look at that, look at this other thing, then I think, it may not come naturally, but they can, they're still capable of learning it and getting pretty good at it in some cases.
Right.
And so one model I like for personality types is called social styles. And the thing I like about that model in particular is it's based on externally observable behavior. So I don't need you to have a sign on your forehead that says what personality type you are. I can look at explicit aspects of your body language, which I actually have written out for me, and I can see, okay, based on the fact that this guy is, he tends to start talking before I'm done, and he's leaning forward while he talks, and he uses his hands a lot. That gives me some clues about your personality type, and then that gives me some clues about how I might try interacting with you. And because I've got this set of instructions, this makes sense to me as a
decoder ring.
Yes, essentially. Right. So we have our personality decoder ring. Perfect.
Yeah, so the whole idea of, one of the things I think that's interesting about many people in their career pathing is that they tend to be specialists sometimes in a particular area or a niche or something. And so there's this idea in the team, in the notion of team, that's thinking more about role density and saying to yourself, okay, these individuals that have these kind of specialist things, they can also be cross-trained for other specialties, right, to mix in. And so maybe that also helps in a team environment. When someone isn't available for something, you have another person that could step in, or even to the extent of things like turnover.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, role density is something where it's really useful to have a whiteboard to draw a very simple diagram. But the idea behind role density is that if each person can only play their own role and they don't have the ability to flex into anybody else's role, then if you lose any person, then you've got a big hole in your team. And the whole idea behind cross-functional teams is you've got a lot of disciplines represented on your team. So everybody's already an impact player because of the cross-functional aspect of it. But if you can cross-train people so that they have greater role density, meaning each person has at least some ability to play a role that somebody else might be playing primarily, but other people can play secondarily, then it really partly goes back to that short feedback loop idea where the more I'm cross-trained to perform some other role to a point, the more I'm going to be able to guess what that other role is going to want me to do in my role. So that helps shorten that feedback loop. And then, like you said, if that other person is on vacation or sick or they leave the team entirely, then it gives us a better ability to fill in that role, at least to a degree, while we look for a replacement for that team member, or potentially while we just develop somebody inside the team who is already partly skilled in that role, but just needs to step up a little bit to fully fill that role.
Perfect.
So it gives us greater ability to move people around. It gives us a greater ability to cover issues that come up, gives us a greater ability to have people flex into areas that they might actually like to flex into over time. Some people want to move into a different role over time, and I think that's good for the organization in general.
Yeah. So I think you already tipped a little bit on the professional development aspect, right? I mean, that you can develop that role density through professional development. So there are basically, I think, three kinds of capabilities you're trying to kind of improve in a professional. One being technical knowledge, and that's something that a lot of folks are good at doing.
Yep.
Another, software engineering, and also domain knowledge.
Right.
Those are all really important things for an individual in a team environment to possess.
Yeah, I think of that as a three-legged stool, and for me, that's been an evolution in my thinking over the years. I think earlier in my career, it was really just about technology knowledge. How well do I know C# or Java or whatnot? And I think we still see that reflected in many organizations today where they're just preoccupied with the technology knowledge. That didn't last too long for me in my career because I pretty quickly discovered software development practices or software engineering practices. And so for a long time, I thought, well, really the two pieces that matter are software engineering practices and technology knowledge. It's like, I know how to program in Java, but do I know how to program well in Java?
Right.
The software engineering knowledge is about how to program well. Time went by, and really what I observed was that there were cases where you could get someone who was actually pretty average in the technology knowledge and also not really a standout in the software engineering knowledge, but they were still a real valuable player for their organization because they were the go-to person who understood how the organization worked, how the business of the organization worked. And sometimes we see technical staff being quite cynical about saying, well, so-and-so doesn't understand the programming language nearly as well as I do, but they got promoted and it's all politics. Well, it's not all politics. It's that person actually understands the business better, and they might not understand the technology as well, but if they understand the business better, it is in fact in the business's best interest to promote people who understand the business. So I view this now as a three-legged stool. All three legs of the stool matter, and different people are going to emphasize different legs to different degrees, and it's healthy for the organization to have people emphasizing different legs to different degrees. We want that person who's the language lawyer and the technology expert. We need that resource on the team. We also want the person who's the software engineering expert who understands what kind of processes we should be using and where the pitfalls are. And we also need the person who understands the business inside out. We really want all three of those.
Absolutely. And encouraging people to pursue that, I think, again, with the notion of the team being the measurement yardstick as opposed to necessarily the individual. But you still have the individual who's into that, right?
I think that's an excellent point, and it goes back to why is the main unit of productivity in Agile the team? It's not the individual, it's the team.
Right.
We can't get all those attributes to the degree we want them in any individual, and so we really have to look at the team to get them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So the individual can grow themselves, and you mentioned the professional development ladder. They're standards-based things that you can measure people by uniformly, as opposed to, I think many organizations have perhaps too much subjectivity in how they assess or look at performance of individuals in certain kinds of engineering disciplines, right?
I think what we've seen is that organizations place a lot of emphasis on defining what performance at each level looks like,
right.
But they don't really put much emphasis at all into defining what you need to do to be able to perform at the next level. And this goes back to the growth mindset topic where, in the software world, people really want to learn. And so if the organization can support them by giving them a defined program of how to learn, how do I get to the next level? Well, a lot of managers are really caught flat-footed. They don't know. And really, this is a pretty deep topic. It's really beyond the capabilities of the vast majority of individual managers to put this together on their own. I mean, we've been working on it for 20 years here at Construx. And so, but that you would, in an ideal world, anytime an individual contributor goes to their manager and says, what do I need to do to get to the next level? The manager should have a clear answer. And so that's what we've tried to, and I believe what we have created is the manager can just give them the plan and say, look, if you work toward this, your skills will improve, you will be contributing at a higher level, and you will in fact deserve to be at the next level.
Absolutely. I mean, and the notion of clearly defining that, I think, is something we've learned in positioning the professional development ladder to our own clients, is that so many of them might have something like that, but the individuals who are subjected to it, if you will, feel like there's just not a clear definition of what the levels are or how do I move through those levels. So the notion of having defined career paths and plans that fall out of those paths is super important for that from the standpoint of that capability.
Yeah, and I think, it really is not realistic to expect someone to be able to define what they need to do to go to the next level. I mean, by definition, if they're not at the level, they don't understand what performance at that level looks like.
Right.
So they really do need some guidance in the path to get to the next level, and that's what we have been able to provide.
Absolutely. But I think we could probably spend an entire podcast just on the professional development ladder and career pathing in general. So, I think that's something we probably might think about teeing up in the future, Mr. Producer. Sounds like a good idea. I think today that's all the time we have, so we're going to have to close on that note. I think that was really a good summary. I would encourage you, the listener, to explore more about career pathing and our professional development ladder by downloading Steve's white paper on this topic at our website if you choose to do so. Be sure to tune in again next time for another episode of Inspect and Adapt, the Construx podcast. Thank you, Steve, for joining us this time. We appreciate you being here.
Thanks for the conversation.
Until then, this has been Mark Griffin as your host. Liz Ostashevsky has been our audio engineer. Devin Musgrave is our producer. Have a great next sprint. If you enjoyed this episode and you have comments or would like to talk with one of our practitioners, reach out via email using comments@construx.com. Again, that's comments@construx.com. We'd love to hear from you.